Hey everyone, Jonathan Baylor here, and so excited about this week's bonus Smarter Science of Slim podcast because I have one of my friends actually from my original hometown and where my wonderful brother still lives, and that is the good old greatest city in the Midwest, Chicago, Illinois, and actually a wonderful plastic surgeon by the name of Dr. Ostrich, or Dr. O, as he is known in the iTunes podcasting world, because there's a wonderful podcast where he talks about skin health and all kinds of other wonderful health things, and also his website, MidwestPRS.com. And we are joined, like I said, by no other than the Dr. Ostrich, or Dr. O, here to talk to us about his awesome plastic surgeon experience, but more so how you become beautiful on the inside with proper and scientific and simple diet and nutrition, and then how that makes manifest on the outside. So, Dr. O, welcome.
Hey, welcome. I thought that Omaha was the best city in the Midwest.
Well, it's a toss up. It's a toss up. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, yeah. So, no, thanks for having me on the show, Jonathan. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to have you, Dr. O, because the thing that I love about what you're doing, not only that you're from, my old hometown, but rather that the, I mean, obviously you're a highly trained specialist and you've been in this field for years and years and years, and you are out there on the front lines in the medical arena letting people know, especially individuals who are concerned about their external appearance, that a lot of this is coming from an internal source. Tell me about, I mean, you've got a unique story and a unique perspective. So let's just go back in time and tell us how you got to
Yeah.
where you are today.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a long story in many ways, but I can sum it up in saying that the key thing for me was that, I have two daughters that developed type 1 diabetes. And, that was total shock. That happened during my residency, and my wife had to stop her residency to actually take care of our children. And, slowly but surely, we were exposed to dietitians and kind of the conventional wisdom that was out there in regards to, low-fat diets and whole grains, and no food was restricted in diabetes. But in reality, when the rubber hit the road and we were actually managing blood sugars on young children, we found out that a lot of those things, they simply didn't work because we'd find our children eating bread and pancakes, and their blood sugar would go up to 400 or 500, which, your blood sugar is supposed to be 100, and 4 or 500. Grace, my oldest daughter, when she was admitted to the hospital with diabetic ketoacidosis, her blood sugar was 722.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah. So, I mean, obviously, that wasn't the worst. There are people that go in with 1,000, we were told, and I've seen patients, that sick as during my training. But the bringing it back to my own personal experience, I knew a lot of this stuff was wrong. So I started experimenting with things that were alternate hypotheses, which I found out were actually the original ways to treat diabetes in terms of carbohydrate restriction and things like glycemic index. And slowly and surely, we got to a point where we were getting things like wheat out of our children's diet completely and using alternative flours like almond flour, for instance, and to cook with and make pancakes and things that they liked with. And then I saw this movie called Fathead, which has been a very popular movie for a lot of people who have been trying to lose weight, and it's kind of this kind of underground movie which was made by this guy named Tom Naughton, who I know you know as well.
Yeah, Tom has actually been on the show, so his show will be airing here shortly. So,
Oh, yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, so Tom's a great guy. I saw this movie and I was like, wow, I remember learning this, but I kind of forgot it somehow. And when I saw the movie, I started experimenting with more fat in the diet and more, foods that were quote unquote unhealthy for you, like eggs and, high fat dairy and, meats that were not necessarily super lean cuts of meat, but meats that you like to eat, like a skirt steak, for instance, or a flank steak or something like this. And guess what? My kids' blood sugar was a lot better controlled. And what I found is that I started to lose a lot of weight. And in fact, when I cut out wheat and I cut out all the bad carbohydrates that you have in a modern diet, and I also added the fats and proteins and the nutritious foods that were previously off limits, I found myself back at my high school weight, and I found myself fitting into clothes I had not fit into for 20 years. So when I realized that as a doctor, I realized I had to share that with people. And that became a passion of mine. And I wanted to try to find a way to integrate it on a daily basis. And the best way that I really was able to do that is, as a plastic surgeon, people are always looking to look younger and feel better about themselves, and they want better looking skin and they want to look better. And the key to that is actually on the inside with the food that you eat, because one of the things that I say is that if your eyes are your windows to your soul, then the skin is the window to your general health. Because so many medical diseases express themselves through things like rashes and certain types of things on the skin. I don't want to go too deeply and then it get too wonky, but there are certain things that happen to the skin which are signs of, for instance, thyroid disease or liver disease or cancer or autoimmune disease. So I realized that I had to really focus on my little band of narrow knowledge, because everybody has, a little narrow band that they're really good at. And mine was, surgery and plastic surgery, and trying to integrate diet and nutrition through the skin and through skin health. And, I also do some hand surgery as well. And I also realized that a lot of my patients who were suffering from things like carpal tunnel syndrome were actually suffering not necessarily from carpal tunnel syndrome. They were suffering from type 2 diabetes, which was causing carpal tunnel syndrome. So once again, I could apply diet and nutrition and lifestyle to help them as well. So
Well, that's amazing. I love so many things about what you just said. I actually took I got a half page of notes here, so just lots of good stuff. Let's start from the end and work our way backwards. So just what you
sure.
mentioned there about individuals coming in with quote unquote carpal tunnel syndrome, actually discovering, wait, no, you actually have a broken metabolic system, and one of the effects of that is causing you this pain in your hands. How much of that do you see where individuals are coming in with an acute problem or a so-called acute problem, but it's actually just a manifestation of this much deeper chronic metabolic breakdown?
Oh, I think that's happening more and more. I would say the majority of patients that I see for carpal tunnel syndrome, not the majority, but I would say, one third to maybe even half have type 2 diabetes. Because as you age, you're at higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, whether you're skinny or not, because, the modern diet that you've been eating for, whatever, 50 years. And, there's a lot more people who are obese. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the big problems with medicine today is that, as a doctor, I was trained to identify and diagnose a problem, but I wasn't necessarily taught on how to, think about why that problem was there. We spend a lot of time studying pharmacology and pathology in medical school, basically identifying disease and treating disease. But when the toothpaste is out of the tube, you got to clean it up. But what you want to do is avoid spilling all the toothpaste. And so that's kind of, I think, the philosophy, and that's really the challenge of 21st century medicine, because the costs of medicine are high, the diseases are chronic, we're spending a lot of money. We have to really look back and see, what's causing these diseases and what can we do to help prevent these diseases. So,
Well, I'm going to clap over here. I hopefully that doesn't screw up the audio too much, but I think everyone should just print out the last 3 minutes of dialogue from Dr. O and just paste that on your wall, because I couldn't agree anymore. And Dr. O, I want to unpack that a little bit, because one thing
yeah.
I found fascinating is just talking about like your training as a physician, a highly trained specialist plastic surgeon, one of the largest cities in the country. So obviously at the top of your field, and the what I hear medical professionals telling me is that what they are often taught from a nutrition perspective and an exercise perspective in school is essentially the same thing that people were being taught 40 years ago, which is eat a low fat, low protein, high carbohydrate diet and do as much aerobic exercise as you can possibly do.
Right.
And that literally was written down as the truth 40 years ago and continues to be taught as the truth today. Is that how accurate is that?
Well, I think it's funny, Jonathan, because I think what happened, I have a theory on this. Obviously, the movie Fathead explains a lot of the politics in terms of the scientific, data getting out there and which scientific theory won out in the end. But I think really what it all boils down to in regards to doctors are simply not, our job is to identify and treat disease. And that model was good, for a long time, because the biggest killers were infectious disease, things like trauma, things that killed people were not cancer, they were not diabetes. And now we've kind of, for all practical purposes, really got a handle on infectious disease not only because of the antibiotics that have been developed and some of the vaccinations that have been developed, but just simply because our quality and our standard of living has gone up. We have access to clean water. We understand concepts of hygiene and washing your hands. We have generally better nutrition in terms of calories. People are not starving, let's put it that way. But, things changed, and medicine simply did not change with it, because now the challenge is, how do we keep the horse in the barn? How do we, prevent illness? And that, it's two competing paradigms, and you're basically applying this, what's called a rescue care. Okay, so that's the fancy term for it. Rescue care, which is, we're very good at that in the United States. Look, if you're in a car accident and you go to a trauma center, the chances of you surviving today are much better than they would have been 100 years ago, or even 50 or even 30 years ago. But you can't apply that rescue care paradigm to a chronic illness explosion that we're having. You need a different paradigm, and that paradigm is prevention. And as a plastic surgeon, one of the reasons why I got into it, why I can see things this way, is because plastic surgeons are basically professional jacks of all trades. And we basically take from a lot of different surgical specialties. We operate from head to toe. We have to innovate and solve problems. And that's one of the reasons why I was able to, stand back and say, hey, something's wrong with the way we're looking at the problem. And so I think that's kind of the short, long answer, I would say.
Oh, well, I love that. What you just described is really, I think, on point, at least in my experience, which is certainly not nearly as deep as yours, but that we're practicing in the model of a half a century ago. And it's not necessarily to say that model is bad or wrong. Just like, after World War II, our government meant well. They thought our country would not have enough food, so they went out of their way to provide subsidies for a non-perishable food stuff so that people wouldn't starve to death, and they had a noble intention, and that worked after World War II. But that was an old model. Like, we don't need more starches and sweets, and we don't need to encourage people to consume them anymore. And like this rescue model, it's fine. And if you have a car accident and you need to apply it, then that's great. But this to just take what we did 50 years ago and to blindly apply it today. I can only imagine that's not the way other fields of medicine work. I can imagine when you're performing many of your surgeries, those surgeries are not performed in the same way they were performed 40 or 50 years ago.
Absolutely. The technology has improved immensely in terms of whatever you look at, anesthesia, hospital care, whatever you look at, the technology has improved immensely. And as a result, the rescue care paradigm, when it's applied for rescue care like trauma or a liver transplant or something like this, works beautifully well. But guess what? It doesn't work that well when you have diabetes or hypertension or whatnot. People put you on a medication, or they treat you in a certain way. They put a stent if you have a heart attack, but they're not treating the underlying cause.
Well, it's almost like there's a double layered problem. So it's like one where someone comes in and they have this chronic condition such as diabetes or hypertension, and first it sounds like we look at them and we say we need sort of this rescue model. Like, what can we do now? What can we prescribe? How can we try to jam the toothpaste back into the tube, for lack of better terms? But then there's even a second level where it seems like for a lot of physicians, the quote unquote prescription they would write to a diabetic patient is you need to eat more whole grains.
Yeah.
And so it's like they come with the wrong paradigm, and then they actually give the wrong practical advice because that's the advice we had 40, 50 years ago.
You're absolutely right about that. And the thing is because doctors don't have the time necessarily to sit back and think about this, because they, for me, I probably would have been in the same situation if I didn't have a kid that had diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
It took a shock to the system, because you can have this, I guess what they call, cognitive dissonance, or just basically two conflicting ideas in your head. Because if you really think about it, I mean, as a doctor, you studied anatomy, you studied physiology, you studied biochemistry. You know that if you eat sugar, it raises your insulin, it raises your blood sugar. It's not a good state to be in. And on the other side, you are saying a low-fat diet, that's the ADA diet, that's the AHA diet. It's the diet that's prescribed. Eat less, exercise more. So it's like you have these two conflicting things, and you don't have the time to reflect on, hey, these are not, meshing together, and maybe there's another way to think about this. So, that's part of what I do as a plastic surgeon, because really, when somebody comes to me looking for improvement on their skin, their health, their face, their body, whatever it is, if I took a cookie cutter approach and just said, hey, I'm going to just do this, I wouldn't have very many happy patients. But I have to step back, I have to look at the big picture, and I have to individualize. So I'm lucky that I had, in a way, I'm lucky that my kids developed diabetes. So it was like a blessing in disguise. It's a one way to look at it. I mean, it's a horrible disease to have. I hate it. But, I learned so much, and I was able to integrate this knowledge as a plastic surgeon and the skills that I've been taught into something that I could, try to share with other people to kind of, illuminate them so they could find their own way to health, and they could see some of the things that they were doing wrong and why they were coming to roadblocks in their life.
Well, and thank God that you have. I mean, talk about taking lemons and making some lemonade, some low sugar lemonade.
Yeah. Yeah.
You certainly have. Well, and I'm curious, Dr. O, since being someone who's at the top of the medical profession, here's another example. Like, you gave the great example of cognitive dissonance of, what sugar does in the bloodstream, and yet the diet you're prescribing, but there's like something is not connecting those two bits. A great example, I was speaking with Dr. Donald Lehman over at the University of Illinois, so relatively close. He's one of the premier protein researchers in the world. And a quote during our conversation that I just love that he said, I'd like to share here and get your take on, is as follows. All starches from grains are simply a long chain of simple sugars connected together. The term complex carbohydrate just means a long chain of sugars. As soon as a food is digested and absorbed, the body does not know the difference between a simple sugar and a whole grain. Now, just to distill that down, if you eat these magical whole grains, as we're taught, when it leaves your stomach, truly, it is the same as if you drank a can of Coke. Mm-hmm. Now, that is a fact. Like, that is a biological fact. But why do we still get these recommendations then? Like, the USDA doesn't say fill half of your plate with, or whatever, a quarter of your plate with Coca-Cola, but they still insist that a quarter of your plate has to be healthy whole grains. What's going on?
I've thought about this for a long time, Jonathan, and I'm not particularly one who has conspiracy theories in the sense that there's a man behind the curtain pulling all the strings. But I think really what happens is that you have the USDA that's incentivized, to promote grains, because they protect the interests of farmers and big corporations who produce a lot of grains. That's where the subsidies go. So they're incentivized in a particular way. And so that's kind of trickled down through the scientific information and the guidelines of some of these bodies like the ADA for the diabetes and the AHA, the Heart Association. And so I think you have that going there. I also think you have a problem with just the average guy or even the average doctor kind of understanding, when you say the word complex carbohydrates, what does that connote? It connotes that, it's complex. It's interesting. It's good. When something's complex, it's hard or it's hard to digest. And that's the imperfection of language. I see this all the time in the sense that, not to go off too much on a tangent, but, when we talk about the process of inflammation in our bodies and the process of healing in our bodies, everybody thinks all inflammation is bad. And the fact is you can't live without inflammation. And people think that when your body heals, that it's regenerating. It's not always. In fact, it's very interesting is because humans don't necessarily regenerate much of their bodies. The bones, to an extent, can regenerate, but the rest of your body heals with scar tissue. It's replaced, actually. So part of it, I think, has to do with misaligned incentives, and part of it has to do with just conveying what the idea is through the imperfections of language. And that's kind of a double-edged sword. It's hard to convince some people that complex carbohydrates are sugar or fat is not bad for you. Part of it is also the fact that, and this is probably the third part of the double-edged sword, is that we've been told so much that fat is bad for you that we just kind of accept it. This whole process of reiterating the same thing over and over again until someone believes it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's a complex psychological process. And I think a fourth thing would be just the fact that people don't always eat for nutrition. People eat for religious reasons or spiritual reasons or environmental reasons. And that's some of the reasons why people would like to have more grains and vegetables in their diet, because they think that is, that's more on whatever level it is spiritually. Mm-hmm. So those are the main reasons that I think. There are probably many more.
Oh, absolutely. Well, this is an area where I think we could definitely talk for quite some time. But there's one other area that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up today, Dr.
Sure.
O, and that is you mentioned something right in your initial story, which I really loved, and it was something along the lines of this idea of everything, and I mean everything, in moderation is promoted as the only, let's call it, non-fanatical approach.
Right.
To nutrition, everything in moderation. Like if you talk about eliminating anything, that's perceived of as fanatical. Call me crazy, but my opinion is that continuing to recommend a way of eating that has caused the worst healthcare crisis in the world, that is fanatical. But that's just me. What do you think?
Well, yeah, basically, in regards to everything in moderation, that had to do with the fact that when we were with the diabetes educators and the nutritionists, they said that there's no forbidden food for diabetics. And in one sense, I understood what they were trying to say, because the psychological weight of having this disease all the time and always having to watch what you eat and always being the only kid at a birthday party, not having cake or a cupcake, is a bad thing. But, to say that there's not foods that you should cut out in your diet, it's ridiculous. So what are you going to tell a celiac patient? Just have wheat in moderation? Or what are you going to have somebody who has a deathly allergy to shellfish or eggs, and you're going to say, oh, just have those in moderation and you'll be okay? The fact is, metabolism and your health and your wellness, it doesn't lie. So you obviously cannot tell somebody who has celiac disease or allergies or something else that they can eat that food in moderation, because they can't. And for diabetics, carbohydrate restriction is very important. It's a very good tool for a lot of diabetics to use. And for most people as well, because one of the things that I learned because of my own personal story and, eating like my daughters do, because I realized that the best thing that I could do for them was be an example, is that if it's good for a diabetic, it's probably good for you, because the only thing that's different between you and a diabetic is that you don't make insulin. But that doesn't mean that when you eat wheat, your blood sugar doesn't get jacked up and you have to control it, and there's not an inflammatory process and a whole hormonal cascade that's going out of whack because of what you're eating, because you can make insulin.
I like to sometimes think of because what you just said is spot on. If it's good for a diabetic, it's probably good for you too. In some ways, I like to think of an individual who has diabetes as someone who's walking on a balance beam that simply doesn't have a net underneath them, whereas an individual who doesn't have diabetes is walking on that balance beam but does have a net underneath them. Meaning for the diabetic, it's just a lot worse if they fall. It's a lot. They have to be
Yeah.
much more careful. But we all, like, if you fall, even if you fall into the net, you can still hurt yourself. And if you fall into the net too many times, eventually the net's going to break, and then you don't have a net anymore. So,
Right.
so your guidance is absolutely spot on. And the thing that I think is also interesting, and I bet especially with your focus on skin health, I'm curious to get your take on is. So people say, well, we have to eat something. So if you eliminate these starches and sweets, what do we eat? And by and large, many of those calories are replaced with fats, which my research shows, and is pretty. It's not my research. It's really just human biology. Is that we know it is a fact. It is an undisputed fact. Even the USDA document that precedes the guidelines, like this giant long document they have on which this is all based, acknowledges that the absolute human requirement for dietary carbohydrate is 0, which doesn't mean we should all eat 0 grams of carbohydrate. It just means it is not an essential thing for the body to have. Where if you replace many of your starch and sugar calories with some protein and then natural fats, because fat is required for hormone production and for cell production and for skin health, that men, your testosterone levels are better. For women, your estrogen levels are better. Your skin heals. That essential nutrient, those essential healthy fats, when we increase the proportion of those in our diet, magic happens. Has that been your experience?
Oh, yeah. I think one of the things that got me thinking about skin health and health in general in regards to fat is that after I saw Fathead, I thought about something when I was younger. My mom had a dog. We had a dog growing up. And one of the things that the person who told us, it was a Yorkshire Terrier. And, one of the things that the person who sold us the dog told us is that, if you want the dog's coat to be really shiny, feed it a few eggs with its dog food.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, that just came into my mind after I watched Fathead. And I was like, there's got to be a connection here between humans, because we're, when you look at us, we're different, but in so many ways we're not different in terms of our physiology and metabolism. And yes, that's one of the things that happened to me, and especially to my wife, that she noticed right off the bat, is that she thought I was crazy when I was doing all this stuff, because I was totally the proselytizer of the house for a little while. and she was like, come on, you're crazy. And we started doing this, and she started getting all these first of all, her tennis game improved immensely, so she loved that. She had way more energy playing tennis. But then all her friends were complimenting, like, your skin looks radiant. What are you doing? And she's like, I'm not doing anything. I just cut out wheat out of my diet, and I've added things like coconut oil and eggs. And how many eggs do you eat? Oh, we eat a couple eggs every morning for breakfast. Oh, my God, aren't you afraid of heart disease? Blah, blah, blah. And so how it went. My wife saw that her skin improved. She told some of her friends, and their skin improved, and everybody became interested. Now my wife is she's like the big person, like, is this gluten-free? Let's double check. Is it certified gluten-free? And I'm like, I don't know. I just bought it. It said gluten-free. Well, let's double check. And so she's become totally converted now. So that's been very cool to see. And our kids' health has improved a lot too. So I think that's a really, really wonderful thing about the diet, is because when your family eats healthy and everybody's healthy, that makes your family life a lot better as well. And that's an important thing too, because it's not just about diet, but if diet can help you with that, then it's worth it.
Oh, and I think you hit the nail on the head there, where it's like, everyone's happy. And the thing that's great here is because you have things like these almond flowers and coconut flowers, is that actually when you go on a saner lifestyle, or a lifestyle where you're getting your calories and your nutrients from things you can find directly in nature, these are savory, delicious. I mean, there's nothing. It's not like you can't eat sweet things anymore. You just get your sweet tastes from different substances. It's not like you can't eat anything that has a bread-like consistency anymore. You just make your bread-like things with different ingredients, and you have this wide palette of colors with which to
Right.
paint a beautiful picture. It's not like this low fat, blood, boring, dry. It's delicious and it's good for you, which is helpful.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right, and it forces you to be a little creative too, because I think a lot of people become very complacent. Like we live in a culture where we're expected that if you take 5 minutes to microwave something, that's dinner, and that is so unusual to compared to the whole of human history. I mean, we've kind of become spoiled with all these 7-Elevens thinking that you can just grab your food. It's important. You got to prepare your food a little bit and take a little investment into your food, and you'll see the results pay off. Because I got kids now. I mean, my daughters eat smelt, they eat tuna fish, they eat sardines, they eat all these wonderful things that most kids in their class are just like, I would never even touch that, or that's gross. You know how it is. So you really actually you end up expanding your palate, because if you really think
Hmm.
about a low-fat diet, or people who are obese, either, they're very monotonous eaters. They'll eat just like hamburgers and French fries all day, very picky eaters, or a low-fat diet. I mean, if it's just like all grains and it's not, it's all just grains and flavors. There's no real variety to it.
No, that's absolutely in some ways. Um, the if individuals could just stop eating like off the children's menu in a lot
Yeah,
of and that's so sad, right? One, it's that's sad for a minute. Like the fact that a children's menu is characterized by garbage food is a travesty in and of itself. But in a lot of ways, you're exactly right. It's if we just don't eat like a child and we eat like like an adult, health kind of takes care of itself a little bit.
yeah. No, you're absolutely right, Jonathan, without a doubt. And that's a great way to put it. It's eating off the kids' menu, and that's something that we had to, overcome when we ate out with our daughters. So our daughters would always pick out something from the regular menu and just split it. I mean, the kids' menu is toxic. French
Hmm.
fries, chicken strips, yeah, tater tots, hamburgers that are there's no meat in them even. It's like a little sliver of meat and it's all bun. It's
Yeah.
terrible. And then you put a bunch of ketchup on it.
Oh yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
that's that's no good at all. Well, Doctor O, this is just awesome stuff. I really appreciate. I mean, what you're doing from an integrative perspective, I think, is brilliant, and certainly you're providing a great service to all the wonderful inhabitants of Chi-Town, as I fondly call it. So, folks, if you haven't listened to Doctor O's show, please go up onto iTunes, add right next to your subscription to the Smarter Science of Slim podcast. Search for the Dr. O Show, which is a wonderful resource. Check him out at MidwestPRS.com. He's got a wonderful blog up there, and I'm sure you're going to continue doing good stuff, Dr. O. So thank you so much for all that you do and all that you represent and for joining us today.
Jonathan, thank you for having me on the show. It was a real pleasure. And also, thank you for all the wonderful stuff that you do. Your book, Smarter Science of Slim, is something that I recommend to a lot of my patients and a lot of people that I know, because it is so well written and so easily accessible, and dispels some of these ideas that have been ingrained in us in terms of grains and fat and calories, in a way that's really accessible to the person who has, not necessarily scientific mind, but wants to know this information. So thank you once again for all that you do.
Oh, my pleasure, Dr. O. Well, and thank you, listeners, for listening. And please tune in next week. We'll continue to tell you how you can eat more and exercise less, but do that smarter. Talk to you soon.